Good morning and welcome to another broadcast by the ACT Chess Association of their online events, which are currently being held every Wednesday evening on chess.com. My name is Sean Press. I organise these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association, and the event we're looking at is last night's rapid play event. It was a 5-round tournament, played with a time limit of 10 minutes plus 2 seconds per move. The winner of the tournament was candidate master Wei Li, who's a regular winner of this event. He scored 4.5 out of 5, 4 straight wins, and just a short draw at the end to wrap up first place. In second place was Amir Malik on 3.5 out of 5. And then there was a big tie for third on 3 points, and between Matthew Bennett, Victor Braggon, Stephen Mugford, and Kevin Liu from Sydney, who I featured in last week's broadcast. But the game I'm looking at today is the game between the first place finisher, Wei Li, as black, and Matthew Bennett, who finished tied for third as white. Now, this is a long game, so it may take a while to get through. Normally, I avoid long games because obviously it does take a fair bit of time to broadcast them. And two, sometimes they potentially can be a little bit dull, depending on the style of the players. So we're going to go with this one because especially towards the end, the ending is particularly interesting. I will point out that especially when you get to the end in short time control events, as I said, this was played with a time limit of 10 minutes plus 2 seconds a move. You're only able to have about 2 or 3 seconds per move. Some people say this diminishes the quality of endings, and I tend to agree with them. But on the other hand, it does then stress the importance of learning your endings, because if you can reel off a number of very strong moves in a very short period of time at the end of the game, you're obviously more likely to be able to win. So we start with d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, c4, which is Queen's Gambit at this point. Can be accepted, can be declined. In this case, it was declined as a Slav. e3. I'm not really up on Slav theory. Bishop g4 looks a bit double-edged. And Queen b3 is a nice idea. Pressuring the center, breaking the pin, and taking on b7. In this case, it's met by Queen b6. And then we play knight c3. Queen takes b3 can be tried here. And I've featured this kind of idea before in another couple of games. White isn't particularly worried about a takes b3. And much as there's double pawns, it also gives the rook something to do much earlier in the game by attacking down the A file than normally would be the case. So instead, black decided to give white double pawns by taking on f3 straight away. G takes f3, pawn to e6. But having the pawn on f3 actually helps white a little bit, because you can play the aggressive e4 move here, which you want to get in most openings. If you play d4, try and play e4 at some point. And if you play e4, try and play d4 at some point. It's pretty easy to remember. So d takes c4, bishop takes, and black decided to swap queens at this point. The advantage/disadvantage now, of course, is that the bishop can take back, so there's no damaged pawn structure. And I tend to like white's position here for a couple of reasons. When you're assessing positions, often you do a bit of comparison about various features in the position. White has the two bishops, bishop on b3, bishop on c1, so they can cover the whole board, while there's just a bishop on f8 for black. The two pawns in the center is always very nice. If you can maintain those pawns, finding the right time to push one of them, because it's supported by other, is often good. The drawback for white's position, of course, is the pawns on f3 and f2. Especially the pawn on f2 is weak. It's not doing anything. And in some lines, the knight can land itself onto f4, and it can't be chased away by pawns. But black continued to develop, which is good, and white castled. Now, in this position here, I probably like a move like king e2. Normally, you get your king out of danger and out of the center, but with the queens off and the center very strongly in favor of white, king e2 is not a bad idea. The rook has more squares to get to straight away, and more importantly, when we get to the ending, and this game did get to an ending, the king is already in the center, ready to join the fight. But after castling, bishop e7, because black wants to castle as well, and decides to castle on the king side. So we now start throwing our rooks across to the open files. In this case, the rook on d1 is going to support the pawn on d4. The rook comes across. And again, I thought that rook going to c1 straight away was the right idea. What white's essentially going to try and do, or should try and do in this position, is play d5 at the right moment. And after the pawns get exchanged in the center, try and be the first to get your rook to the 7th rank, to try and get your rook to c7, where it's incredibly strong. Instead, a4 for space, a5 counters that. We get rook ac1 anyway, rook ac8, and the bishop dropped back. I think this was a little bit unnecessary, a move like this. I'm not quite sure what white's plan here is in this position. And the knight went back as well to open up the d file. Undeveloping moves are often hard to find, and it's a question of where you want to put your pieces. The other option was to try something like knight f8, then to g6, play the other knight to h5, and then plunk something onto f4. And now was the time that white really needed to find the right break, and it turned out, unfortunately, they found the wrong one. e5, I didn't like at all. The problem, for a number of reasons, is that one, it allows black to occupy the d5 square without any real dramas, and the pawn on d4 is now backward on the open file, so it's always going to be under pressure from the rook. But the main reason why I don't like e5 is because it's not as good as d5. I mean, in chess, sometimes you make these practical choices. So after d5, you're already threatening to tear the center apart. And remember, white has 2 bishops. White wants an open position. For the 2 bishops are much stronger in open positions where there's less pawns on the board than the knights, which are better in closed positions because they can jump around. So, for example, if we play e takes, bishop to b4, d takes c6, knight takes c6, and knight e4, and I still like white in this position. Still got the 2 bishops. The rooks are well placed in the center, as are blacks, of course. You are threatening immediately to play knight takes f6 and wreck black's pawn structure, and if black takes on e4, then you're straightening out your pawn structure with pawn takes e4. At the moment, the only drawback is the double pawns, and maybe white didn't want to go into a line like this because they felt that the ending was going to be worse for them. But we'll come back here and we'll just look at something else. This is a nice long line. If instead the knight took, white actually gets a much bigger advantage. We take and we take the rooks off on the c file, and then you take on d5. The rook is threatening to pick up the pawn on a5, and if you try and defend it with knight c6, you get rook to d7, which was your goal all along. The bishop can't move because of the f7 pawn, and the b pawn on b7 is under attack. Try and defend it with a rook, and you're just going to get whacked by bishop to f4. Another piece of advice I received years ago about 2 bishops from Roger Farrell, who is a very strong Canberra player, was he said one of the things that having 2 bishops does is you can prevent your opponent's rooks from occupying the squares that they want to occupy. So on the back rank especially, the rooks are looking for places to go, like open files, but with 2 bishops you can kind of harass them a little bit. So white is much better in this position. Because after e5, knight d5, knight e4, which I think was what white was kind of looking at and trying to exploit the square by putting the knight on c5 or d6, knight a6 here, and the bishop went back to b1. c4 was probably slightly better, but after knight b4, king g2, the position's equal here. There's still a lot of play. I'm not going to try and solve this position for you. But bishop went back to b1, h6, pawn to f4, and again, I'm going to be critical of this move. This move only works if you're going to get in f5, but if you don't get in f5, you've just turned the bishop on e3 into just another pawn, basically. It's not attacking anything, it's defending a few things, but even then, these bishops need to be more active. So knight b4, and knight c5 here. So this is a square. You're threatening to take on b7, so why not just play b6 and attack the knight? It could potentially be a little bit weak later, but it turns out not to be. I mean, the c pawn also becomes a little bit weak as well. So the knight jumps back to d3, and black just swaps it off. King f8. By the way, the more pieces that come off and allow white to retain the 2 bishops, the better it should be. And f5, the move that I went needed to be played, gets played, but by now it's not helping. Black could have been a little bit more dynamic here. One of the most common observations about Hui Li's play is that he's very, very solid to the point where he tends to have a high percentage of draws. And sometimes you've just got to be a bit more dynamic if you're going to accumulate points. So, for example, you play c5, pressuring the center, and the bishop goes to a6. Rook here, bishop b7. And in the end, this excursion of the bishop doesn't really help white that much. Okay, because after bishop g5, you're pressuring the e3 pawn. And you have to play rook c3. When I was first looking at this game, I reflexively looked at king f2 and then realized that c takes d4 is just winning for black. So that was a blunder to avoid. Rook to c3. And then we still take in the center. But then the rook comes across and black is now pressuring the d pawn. And as I said before, this was one of the criticisms of the e5 break early on, that this d pawn is now very much under pressure. But instead, black just swapped. So removes the advantage of the two bishops for white. I mean, the knight was a pretty good piece, but it has created a few weaknesses in the position. And bishop to g5, as in the previous line, c5 could have also been played with the same idea. But bishop g5, we're pressuring the e-pawn. King goes to e2, king goes to e7. Weirdly enough, white actually had a surprisingly good rook move in this position, which is throw the rook back to h1 with the idea of playing h4. Because you're just threatening to win a piece. And after bishop check, king here, white actually is not too badly off. And in fact, I've got a slight advantage for white in this position. So white took and took, still with the bad pawns, king e2. c5 finally gets played as required. So the bishop now goes to b5. Could go to a6 to hit the rook as well on c8. And you play b5 just to try and protect the d pawn. And white just took, black just took. Here, you can't take back straight away because of the pin on the e-pawn and the bishop lined up against the rook down here. So swapping first, but then you're now giving black the open c file, and it already becomes advantageous. If you played the seemingly plausible e-takes to keep your pawn structure a little bit better off, the rook just lands on c2 now. And then after king e f3, the h pawn can go or the b pawn can go, take your pick. So white took in the center, but of course rook c2 happens anyway now. So now the position is starting to fall apart a little bit for white, except white had this, I wouldn't say hilarious line, but actually quite an interesting line. Almost impossible to spot at the short time controls. But if you're looking for swindles, king d3, give the h-pawn up. You play rook d7, forces the king back to f8, because otherwise there's a discovered check with the rook, which you don't want to have happen. Rook comes back here to attack the b and the d pawns, a pawns, and you're already looking at picking up one. So you then capture here on e6, and now your e-pawn might have a chance of reaching the end of the board. Even though this position is considered equal, it's equal only if black now starts finding correct moves. Rook check, king here, rook takes, give up another pawn. There have been some really good endings in the world of chess and chess history where one side just surrenders a whole lot of pawns in return for an active king and a passed pawn and some active rooks. The Capablanca, I think Tartakova game is an absolute classic in this regard and is used in a lot of coaching manuals. So rook check, and then you've got king g6, and suddenly you're threatening mate in one with rook to e8. Now, this probably was the best line for black going forward anyway. So after bishop e7 here, to stop the mate, you play rook takes here, and it's not going to be mate if you don't muck it up. It could be if you don't get it right. But certainly white's position has had a lot more chances in it now, and black could have gone wrong at a few points here. So this was a much more interesting line that white could have tried with king d3. Instead, went passive with rook d2. Rook comes back to c5, hitting the e-pawn. Rook goes to d7, king goes to f8. But the problem here now is that the e-pawn is very hard to defend. So we could try king f3 again with the same idea of getting the king active. Rook takes, play e4, and the rook actually doesn't have many squares. The black rook is only has c5 to get to, and then even after rook d6, suddenly you're winning back a few pawns here. So it's not too bad. Rook b7 turned out to be wrong, and the reason it turns out to be wrong becomes clear very shortly. Rook takes, you think, oh, we're swapping pawns, okay, but rook takes e3. So you've dropped another pawn, but more importantly, the white king, which really needed to join in the game, really needed to come forward to support his own pawns and also to harass black pawns, is now stuck at the back of the board here. So after rook, king f2, the rook goes to b3, and we're hitting the b2 pawn. And I'm sure both players were really short of time at this point. Whaley's always short of time. Matt Bennett may well have been. Really needed to play rook takes as the last chance in this position. Rook takes, and rook e2. And try and hold this ending of basically opposite coloured bishops. And they're notoriously drawn, but not always. And in fact, after rook b8, king e7, king f6, bishop c6, here is a way of defending the pawn. Black just sensibly swapped off into that ending. And as much as most of these endings are drawn, this one turned out not to be. If black had been greedy, black could have played the bishop check here. And after king e2, drop the bishop back here. And the idea is now that the b pawn is undefendable and the rook will take it while protecting the bishop on b6 at the same time. Some good little tactical tricks in endings always work out a little bit better. So rook takes b7, bishop takes, and you go, right, we've got this ending now. It's only a pawn in favour of black, but there are two things working in black's favour here. One, the e pawn, it's passed. Two, the king, the black king is a little bit more active. If white can set up what we call a fortress, which basically means park the white king on a good square where it can block the pawns, and the bishop has plenty of room to shuffle around, maybe white could hold the draw. But I couldn't find a decent fortress in this position. So king e5, b3. So what white does now, and it's sensible play, but it turns out to just be a little bit slow, is that in opposite coloured bishop endings, you can afford to put all your pawns on the opposite colour squares to the bishop of your opponent, because it means they can't be attacked. And also, if you're trying to draw the position especially, then you can normally defend them with your own bishop. So, and we'll see an example here. The king goes to d4 to try and attack the pawn on b3. So the bishop goes back to a6, and the bishop will just come to c4 and protect the pawn. So king c5 may not have been necessary here, especially after bishop c4 demonstrates to black that those pawns on the queen side aren't getting captured. But this just means that black turns his focus onto the queen side. So pawn up. Let's see how we go here. King comes forward. Bishop to f4. Gains a little bit of time here just to attack the h pawn. So h3. And then king goes to d4. So basically the idea is white wants to try and stop this e pawn from coming down the board. And there's a couple of squares where they can set up a defensive position. The king going to e2 is the obvious one because the dark square bishop won't be able to put it in check, and it blocks the path of the pawn. But there is another problem which white has to deal with, and black is very sensibly aiming for here. So the bishop goes here, of course, bishop down, bishop here. So we're just looking at stopping this pawn from moving for now. Just move the bishop back. I suspect players were trying to gain time on the clock here with a bit of shuffling. Bishop here. But now, once the bishop's moved off that diagonal, e4 happens. So the king goes to e2. And then it's a question of how can white possibly stop black from getting through. And I think here h4, maybe h4, I was going to say h4, h5 is the right idea, but then you run into the problem of h4, h5. And I'm just doing this one on the fly. So after bishop d6 here, which has happened, if you play this, I'm just thinking this is the right plan here, because essentially as much as you win that pawn, black is going to capture, and then you've got to worry about the g pawn coming down the board as well. So bishop c4 instead, pawn went to g5, and what black is simply trying to do is create another pass pawn. And it's a lot harder in opposite colour bishop endings to defend with two pass pawns. One you can generally dig in, two becomes very difficult. h5, bishop f5, trying to keep an eye on both of those things at once. King back to drive the bishop away, and bishop d7 to try and keep everything under control. The other idea was to just play bishop g6 here, and the main reason being that if black tries to protect the pawn by playing here, then this pawn is actually doing a good job of stopping both of these pawns from coming up the board. So instead you really do play g4, because after h4, if you take and take, of course, we have our passed pawn. But after we go like this in an attempt to win the h5 pawn, king here, bishop takes h5, bishop e7 is just going to capture the pawn though. And you run like this, and suddenly again we've got the two passes, which is very hard to stop, and they're further up the board. So bishop d7, g3, bishop h3, and at first I thought maybe this was the tricky fortress position that white might have been looking for. The pawn can't move, the bishop's stopping. This king's sitting here and doing a good job of preventing the pawn from moving forward, and the bishop can probably just shuffle back and forward on h3 and f1. The only flaw in this plan is if the bishop is over on this side of the board, what's protecting the pawns on this side of the board? And the black king is probably just going to time it right and just run around and start capturing the pawns on b3 and a4. So this goes to show how tricky these endings can be, especially when shorter time. So the bishop went back here, king went to f4 to support the g4 push, bishop to c6, and then g4 was played. And I'm giving an exclamation mark because it's the right plan here. H takes. H4 actually was also a move worth considering, because the bishop on c6 can't protect h1 for now, and there's a good chance that either the h pawn is going to run, or if the king tries to stop it, the e pawn is going to run. Instead, taking was fine though. Bishop to b5, g3. White could have tried to drag it out a little bit longer with bishop d7, because g2 doesn't work because the king will just come across and take it. But king f1 turned out to be the wrong move here, because you can play something like king f3, and after bishop e2, well, after king f3, you're just threatening g2, and then when the king goes to g1, you just play bishop c5 check, and you make a queen. Bishop goes to e2, but king goes here, and when the bishop moves back, because you're threatening g2 again and then winning the bishop, king d2, and you're completely winning this position, because the e pawn is going to come down at some point, and this happened actually in the game later. g2 is going to get played, and once the king takes, then e2 is going to get played, and the bishop has to sacrifice for the e pawn, otherwise black will get a queen, and then without anything left to defend these pawns here, the king is just going to capture the pawns and make a queen. For those of you that wondered, bishop and rook pawn, in this case the bishop is protecting a1, so there's no drawing chances there for white. So bishop c5 was played instead. Still works, by the way. It's not a bad move. King goes to g2, and then the bishop just jumped in here to protect the pawn. Bishop c4. So white now is just reduced to shuffling, and this just gives black a chance just to march the king through. d3 here just to protect the pawn. Bishop goes back, and then king d2. And this is the ideal position. We just want to play this move position here because white has no chance of stopping. I'll just throw one more line in. The desperation line, which doesn't work, is b4. And after taking, trying to run the pawn up the board. But the problem is the bishop on f2 is also guarding a7. So you take, you play a7, you take. But the b pawn becomes a queen in this position. So no tricks there. King goes back to f1. Pawn goes to e3, as I said. Bishop b5 leads to the same situation of g2 takes and e2 takes and takes. If you play bishop e2, g2 is the same thing. G2, but in this case, after taking, king takes, and in fact you've still got the e pawn on the board, and that's going to become a queen pretty shortly. So that was Hui Li as black winning against Matt Bennett. Roundabout here was where white went wrong. And there were a couple of just moves where white could have played better, but conceptually I think the real issue here was this king down here never got into the game. This king really needed to be much more aggressive in an ending like this, and getting stuck on the second and first ranks really was the real problem that black never quite overcame. You know, rook b7, rook b8 check, allowing the black king to get into the game also helped a lot. So that was last night's ACT Chess Association Wednesday Rapid Play event. As I said, my name is Sean Press. I do run these on behalf of the ACT Chess Association. However, we're down to one tournament a week now. People still enjoy them. That's why I'm running them, and we still get a smallish field. Be nice if more people came and played. But still, if you just want to play probably 90 minutes to 2 hours of online chess against some established Canberra chess players, just look for the ACT Chess Association Club or ACTCA Chess Club on chess.com and apply for membership. However, if you are applying, need to know your real name, of course, just for fair play reasons. We find that in our events we have very little instances of actual cheating or people using engine use, and the main reason for that is because we generally know each other in real life as well. And if you're going to use an engine to beat your chess playing friends, it's pretty embarrassing then to have to front up to a real tournament and look them squarely in the eye and going, oh yeah, that game that I won, I cheated. So I do these broadcasts normally the day after. So Thursday next week, I'll be doing probably the summary of this game. The next tournament. Normally around 10 a.m. Started a little bit late today. I had issues with my microphone, which I spent most of my time trying to fix. So until then, thanks for watching in, and I will see you later.